Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Samantha Power, Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Kennedy School, and I have been given the honor of introducing the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Sadako Ogata, who many of you know, I'm sure, by reputation, if not in person. Madame Ogata will deliver a talk that she has titled On the Humanitarian Front Line, New Challenges in Refugee Assistance. Madame Ogata began her career in the tamer confines of academia. She received her PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley in 1963. And prior to joining the United Nations, she served as professor and later dean of the Faculty of Foreign Studies at the University of Sofia in Tokyo. But hers became a household name in the world of international refugee protection and relief when she was elected by the General Assembly as High Commissioner in early 1991. She has been re-elected twice, which, as many of you know, is a hefty tribute in the politicized and sometimes vituperative world of international diplomacy. This is her third trip to Harvard in as many years, and we would like to think that the excursions have allowed her to oil her analytic tools and gain useful insight, which she might deploy in the next crisis. We can't say for sure, of course, whether her visits to Cambridge have been helpful in this regard, but we can say with certainty, alas, that there will always, always be a next crisis. Let's reflect for a moment upon just the major crises that have sprung since the last time she visited Harvard in May of 1998. In 1998, we now forget, in light of subsequent events, fighting in Kosovo left some 400,000 Kosovo refugees displaced inside the province or in exile in third countries. Then, of course, came NATO bombing in March of this year and the forced exodus of more than 1 million ethnic Albanians. Her agency rushed to the Macedonian and the Albanian borders, erecting camps to feed and shelter the victims of the purge. But no sooner had they finally got the camps up and running than Milosevic signed a peace deal and the refugees hightailed it home. Of course, many of them soon discovered they no longer had homes, as some villages contained only mines and the smoldering debris of family houses, farms, and businesses. No sooner then had UNHCR aided that rapid return than another refugee crisis began to unfold, that in East Timor, in which 250,000 individuals fled the then province. And now, no sooner does the Indonesian military exit the newly independent nation of East Timor than a brutal war engulfs Chechnya for a second time. So far, more than 200,000 Chechens have fled to Ingushetia, and many more are on the way. For those of us who are tempted to think that the High Commissioner's efforts are confined to providing macaroni, plastic sheeting, or woolen blankets to needy refugees, we must think again. Though the logistic quandaries she faces are abundant, I suspect it is the moral and political choices that consume her days and no doubt shorten her nights. Imagine confronting one of the following unwinnable scenarios. It is 1994. Rwandan Hutu militants who have killed some 800,000 ethnic Tutsi have fled into neighboring Congo, along with hundreds of thousands of thirsty, hungry, and disease-ridden Hutu non-combatants. No outside military force is willing to enter the camps to separate the militias from the civilians, the genocidaire from the non-combatants. You are the High Commissioner. Do you close the refugee camps? Do you feed the inhabitants? Do you urge your unarmed civilian staff to confront the killers? Then the Tutsi-led government assures you that the conditions are safe back in Rwanda for refugees to return. Do you believe the officials and help facilitate the repatriation? And in general, how do you ever decide whether the security situation in a volatile region has stabilized enough to support returns? Let's try another one. It's 1992, and the Bosnian Serbs have made it clear that they intend to empty territory under their control of Muslims and Croats. Do you protest the evacuations and refuse to meet with authorities who are condoning or indeed often overseeing this viciousness? Or do you supply the buses to transport Muslims and Croats in the hopes of saving lives and civilizing the inherently uncivil ethnic cleansing operation? To add insult to injury, you learn that the Serbs are demanding $1,000 per head for each person it allows to transit through their territory. Do you instruct your staff to cut off contact with these extortioners, or do you urge them to do all they can to help those desperate to flee scrape up the necessary cash? With winter approaching and civilians in besieged Sarajevo in dire need of food and shelter, you organize an airlift of supplies, but the Serbs insist that they get half of whatever enters the city. Much of it will go, you know, to the very army that is responsible for the siege in the first place, the very soldiers who are shelling the town. Do you agree to a 50-50 split? And finally, it is 1999. In fact, it's November 8, 1999. The humanitarian situation in Chechnya is deteriorating badly. Your staff tends to those who make it across the border, but you have limited access to those civilians on the run within the conflict zone. Do you attempt to negotiate a field presence for your lawyers, doctors, and engineers when they would be operating in a place that no Western military commander would dare deploy his troops? While the major powers can cite the fact that this war occurs behind international borders as an excuse to sit back and wish for the best, the UN High Commissioner, unfortunately for her, but fortunately for the world, enjoys no such luxury. In short, this is not a job for the faint of heart. Madam Ogata has attempted to navigate many of these moral minefields and has somehow managed to preserve UNHCR's reputation for integrity, professionalism, and competence. In an era of compassion fatigue, she has also managed to raise the required funds from sometimes stingy donors. UNHCR has saved millions of lives in the last decade. This is a tribute to the work of Madam Ogata's workers in the field, but is also a tribute to her deft and courageous stewardship in a decade that has sorely needed it. Please join me in welcoming Madam Sadako Ogata, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees.
Thank you very much, Director Power, for your rather dramatic presentation and introduction. I'm delighted to be here again, and I hope that some of the issues that I raise would bring you to responding and questioning some of the assumptions that you may have on what it is that we do. 10 years have passed since we hoped to enter an era in which conflicts would be addressed and contained by effective international responses. 10 years have passed since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and my office, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, continues to pick up the broken pieces of violence and war. We knew, of course, that there would be no quick fix, that a time of uncertain transition would begin. But the transition does not seem to end. No satisfactory conflict resolution system is available, either at the international or at the regional level. Today's wars kill and displace civilians with particular viciousness. They linger unresolved, just to explode again with renewed violence. They are fluid and unpredictable, and there's no predictable, flexible mechanism to contain them. They are rooted in deep ethnic, social, and economic divisions within communities and in the weakness of governments. And no systematic, substantial efforts are made to reinforce governments and to create more equal and harmonious societies. Instead, intervention has become the flavor of the day. Intervention is what international community, that is political leaders, the media, the academics, are chiefly talking about when discussing how to address crises. Also, intervention as a response to conflicts and humanitarian action to help the victims of these conflicts are becoming almost inextricably linked. In fact, humanitarian intervention has become a big soundbite in the current political jargon. Throughout the Kosovo crisis, it was not uncommon to hear that NATO was a humanitarian organization. And I have recently heard somebody say that we went from fighting wars to facing complex humanitarian emergencies. It is true that the sight of terrible human suffering, especially on TV screens, did indeed contribute to trigger many interventions of this decade. Operation Provide Comfort to rescue the Iraqi Kurds after the Gulf War. The ill-fated Somalia expedition. The many efforts deployed during the wars in Croatia and Bosnia. The ECOMOG interventions in West Africa, and this year, Kosovo and East Timor. Governments, bent on convincing their parliaments and citizens to send peace-enforcing troops on dangerous missions, have insisted on the humanitarian character of such endeavors, which made them morally compelling and difficult to object to. Without any doubt, this bears witness to the progress of a collective humanitarian conscience in today's world. This said, I would like to express 3 serious concerns. First, I fear that if intervention is conducted exclusively or mostly as a reaction to moral indignation, only visible tragedies will benefit from the active involvement of the international community. Only those crises which are strategically or geographically closer to the industrialized world, or that are so big and dramatic that they cannot be ignored, will be tackled. In other words, the attention that we devote to situations such as in Kosovo will continue to be disproportionate in relative terms to any effort made to resolve other problems, especially in Africa. Think of Angola, Congo, Sudan or Sierra Leone, but also elsewhere. Think of Afghanistan or the Caucasus region. Second, I'm worried that if we have to wait for humanitarian catastrophes to trigger international responses, we shall make little or no progress on the road to concrete, viable, and predictable conflict resolution in the sphere that matters, which is the political sphere, because by the time crises develop into humanitarian catastrophes, the only responses available to decision makers, the military armed responses, will put the international community into the straitjacket of the intractable problems that the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan has described so eloquently in his address to the General Assembly this year. Conflicting strategic interests, lack of resources, and even more crucially, the issues of intervention versus sovereignty and of the legitimacy of the intervention. Third, has intervention in itself been effective? Let us look at the outcome of some of the recent crises. In this respect, the vantage point of the UN Refugee Agency is very revealing. True, some conflicts have ended, especially among those which had started during the Cold War, in Central America, for example, or in Mozambique. This is certainly positive, although much more the result of negotiations than of intervention as such. But if you take a close look at new crises, those for which interventions were made, you will note that most of them have not been resolved. The plight of the Kurds continues. In the former Yugoslavia, 4 years after Dayton, more than 1.5 million people still live away from their homes, particularly in Bosnia and in Serbia. In Liberia, peace is at best fragile. It is certainly not a tangible reality for people in Sierra Leone, not to mention the powder keg of Central Africa. My central question is therefore, why put all of our cards on military intervention? And in particular, why must we wait until intervention is indeed a compelling humanitarian necessity? Why must we wait until human suffering, or rather the suffering that we watch on television, becomes so intolerable that in order to put an end to it, we must risk upsetting the fragile web of international relations, that very web that we should be carefully preserving to maintain peace and security in the broader context? Why, to stop violence and killing, must we resort to interventions that will inevitably cause so much collateral damage? This is a very big word that has been used widely now, to other human beings, to stability, to international relations at large. Why is the debate on intervention focusing so much on its humanitarian justification? We must look back, I believe, at what happens before we reach the stage of intractable dilemmas. As an example, let us look at a situation in which the international response has been so large and conspicuous that it has become the controversial symbol of the good and evil of humanitarian intervention. Nobody can deny that NATO action in Kosovo has ended the repression of the ethnic Albanians in the province. Those who have returned, the majority, are facing many difficult problems in an environment that is physically and economically destroyed at the onset of the harsh Balkan winter. However, they do not have to face the harassment and intimidation of security forces and paramilitaries. This represents a sea change from the situation of last year. Military intervention in Kosovo may have also shown the resolve of a group of powerful countries to address at least some of the situations in which human rights are violated and civilians are targeted. But it has not resolved all the problems, and other problems have been created. I will not elaborate on the political collaterals of intervention in terms of international relations, regional stability, and economic consequences, but I would like to stress 2 points. One is that the harassment, murder, expulsion, and flight of non-Albanian minorities from Kosovo have neither been prevented nor stopped by the intervention. This is in stark contrast to one of the declared purposes of NATO action, to preserve the existence of a multi-ethnic society in Kosovo. The other, of a broader nature, is the unresolved question of the status of the province. Until the latter issue is decided, it will be difficult to build any administrative and governing capacity in Kosovo, thus delaying sine die, its social and economic development already severely stunted by repression and war. But Kosovo is not only challenging us because it is an unfinished job. To draw lessons for the future, it is also worth looking back at the various steps of international involvement. For many years, the Kosovo question caused only occasional concerns outside the region. It moved to the center of international attention with the increase in tension from early 1998. After the escalation of violence and growing population displacement throughout the following summer, there was probably one last chance to reach a durable peace without irreversibly affecting ethnic coexistence in the province. This was during the period following the Holbrooke-Milosevic negotiations, the withdrawal of some Serbian forces, and the decision to establish an unarmed civilian verification arrangement, the Kosovo Verification Mission. The Kosovo Verification Mission, known as KVM, was a means to buy a negotiated arrangement. By then, however, ethnic relations had deteriorated to a point where much stronger international commitment would have been necessary to bring them back to a reasonable level of normality. More, I believe, should have been done to find a political solution, and above all, to develop a ceasefire mechanism strong enough to verify violations on both sides and translate verification reports into concrete political pressure both on the Yugoslav federal authorities and the KLA. The deployment of the KVM was slow. By the end of 1998, in spite of many appeals joined by humanitarian agencies, it had not reached the level foreseen by the Holbrooke-Milosevic Agreement. Many governments hesitated sending their citizens to a relatively dangerous area, although no KVM staff was killed in Kosovo. After that brief window of opportunity and the failure of further political negotiations, military intervention became almost inevitable, and with it came the intractable dilemmas, the inevitably controversial choices, the collateral damage, and new or unresolved problems. It is, of course, difficult to analyze such very recent history, but I wish to insist on one point. The examination of what was done, or insufficiently done, or not done at all in October 1998 may well be the central point in many evaluation of the intervention in Kosovo. There is always such a point in any crisis. Often, interestingly, that point corresponds to the decision, or rather the lack of a decision, to intervene more robustly when the aim has been to contain rather than to stop conflict. Another situation comes to mind, Rwanda, in April 1994, when the decision, understandable but fraught with incalculable consequences, was made to withdraw peacekeepers, thus leaving genocidal forces completely free to unleash their criminal plan. And I could give you other examples. Containing is, of course, extremely dangerous and has to be done on the ground. Unarmed humanitarian workers know this very well, by the way, since they are usually in the field in these circumstances. As the head of a humanitarian organization, I am certainly not in a position to judge political decisions that were made in respect to the Kosovo crisis during the period leading up to the air intervention in March 1999. But everybody knew that reaching the point of military intervention meant having to activate air attacks, an option far less risky than ground invasion in terms of soldiers' lives. This, in turn, entailed leaving Kosovo to those who wanted to cleanse it from ethnic Albanians. When this happened, UNHCR was faced with a huge, unmanageable refugee outflow, and the world's attention concentrated on the refugee crisis. A new humanitarian dimension was added, indeed, to NATO's intervention. But in response to a refugee crisis that had developed after the intervention had started, the military became providers of assistance, and this was essential given the size of the refugee outflow, although the confusion in roles created problems for humanitarian agencies. Perhaps decision makers hoped that the intervention would have a successful outcome in a shorter period of time. But could a stronger, more decisive, more coherent political approach have avoided the so-called humanitarian intervention, the massive refugee flow, and perhaps the reverse ethnic cleansing which is now pushing tens of thousands of new refugees out of Kosovo? And we should also look beyond Kosovo and beyond the Balkans, a region where, after all, the international community is still prepared to spend a lot of political energy and material resources. What about the Lusaka Agreement, which is supposed to end the war in Congo? What about the Lome Agreement, which has, to a certain extent, stopped fighting in Sierra Leone? In both cases, my office is very interested in seeing the ceasefires become lasting peace, because on this development depends the return of hundreds of thousands of refugees. In both cases, I'm very worried that insufficient resources are being deployed by the international community to ensure the success of the agreements in terms of political pressure, support to peacekeeping arrangements, and development aid to back up peace building. Once again, we may lose the window of opportunity painfully created by political negotiations, conducted mostly thanks to the efforts of some bold African leaders. Once again, we may be confronted with fresh catastrophes, like the exodus of Rwandans in 1994, or the massacres and mutilations of civilians in Sierra Leone in 1998, compelling the international community to make the hard, damning choice between a military intervention fraught with political risks and grave physical dangers, and an abstention which will once again signal the victory of brutal force over political dialogue and negotiation. I am not, and I wish to stress this point, I am not arguing against the use of military force whenever it is absolutely necessary to pursue clearly agreed upon political objectives. But I am against limiting our options primarily to military measures, and I should add, I am of course against the disproportionate use of military force which worsens the inevitable collateral damage caused to civilians. There is an ideal scenario, dialogue and negotiations conducted under an able, visionary, clear political leadership, ready to deploy human and material resources to contain the crisis, in the full knowledge of the complexities on the ground, and, if necessary, backed by the possibility of use force in a manner proportionate and effective to the political goal. This may sound old-fashioned, but rather than face the excruciating dilemmas of humanitarian intervention, I believe that political and diplomatic action deserve a fuller chance. The relative, if belated, success of such action in East Timor may prove my point. There are other means to contain, stop, and ultimately prevent the wars which are at the heart of today's crisis. And from my own perspective, the refugee flows that go with them, this means, I would like to argue, are insufficiently pursued by the international community. Other opportunities to avoid humanitarian crisis and the problems of humanitarian intervention are being missed. Contemporary wars are mostly, although not exclusively, of an internal and even intercommunal nature. They produce refugees, often as an objective and not simply as a side effect. And after they end, when they do end, they almost invariably result in weak states, deeply divided societies, and protracted refugee situations, like in Bosnia, for example. Much can be done, and too little is actually done, to address the outcomes of today's wars. I would like to indicate two areas where we must make fast progress. First, the need to rebuild government, and this is a tall order and somehow a unique new challenge. My colleagues, who are struggling with many others to reconstruct Kosovo today, have defined the situation there not just as post-conflict, but also post-government. The importance of helping weak states strengthen their institutions as quickly as possible, and especially at the very crucial local level, cannot be stressed enough. Physical and economic reconstruction are, of course, a priority, but it is also urgent to devise innovative ways to recreate governing systems, in particular, the law enforcement capacity of the police and the judiciary. Look at post-genocide Rwanda, for example, a country with few judges and full jails. Once more, look at Kosovo. Having assisted millions of refugees to return home to countries emerging from conflict, we at my office are convinced that more has to be done to help rebuild governments in these places and thus prevent tensions for degenerating again into bloody conflict. The second area in which more efforts must be made is the attempt to bring divided societies together to help communities coexist again. Rebuilding societies is complementary to rebuilding government. Communities torn apart by fierce violence must be brought together. They must learn to coexist, and perhaps later, through a process that should include, if I may say, an element of forgiveness, be reconciled. Restoring judicial systems and bringing to justice those who have committed crimes against humanity are very important activities. But we must go further. We must call for more support, and may I add, more creative thinking in designing and implementing projects aimed at reconciling divided communities. In a world in which most refugees and displaced people are victims of communal conflicts, a systematic and professional approach to coexistence and reconciliation, devising concrete projects, may well be one of the directions that we must pursue to prevent refugee flows. This is an area in which humanitarian agencies, with their expertise in human problems, their familiarity with problems of moral pain, violence, and loss, and last but not least, their presence on their ground next to the people, can provide an important contribution. Making reconciliation a primary goal of humanitarian activities and adopting a professional, systematic approach to promoting coexistence may well be the most crucial humanitarian challenge for the next century. Colleagues and students, we must restore a sense of purpose and urgencies to conflict resolution efforts. As I said, these efforts must be made through greater commitment to political and diplomatic negotiations. This requires skills and resources. But sure enough, there will be difficult obstacles to overcome, which neither skills nor resources will be sufficient to tackle. This is why resolving conflict above all requires international leadership. It requires, as Kofi Annan has said, the leadership of the Security Council, perhaps of a reformed Security Council. It requires the leadership of its permanent members. It requires, in particular, the mature leadership of the United States, and by mature, I mean that it must not simply respond to the pressure of media and opinion polls, but be forward-looking, global in its approach, able to set real priorities, and if necessary, discreet. Conflicts, do not forget, are usually resolved away from the limelight. I am not saying that America should take the lead in all peace efforts around the world. Even if this were possible, it would not work. In the field of security, Working through regional forces may be the way forward. In some situations, regional coalitions of concerned and committed states have proven useful as peace enforcement or peacekeeping instruments, effective and, if I may say, proportionate and legitimate. The United States must support these efforts with political backing and resources. Because without the decisive, bold commitment of the United States, no endeavor aimed at resolving or preventing conflict, political, developmental, humanitarian, has a chance to succeed. This is why the decrease in American development aid is so worrying. This is why the tendency to stay away from international involvement, a recurrent and now resurgent temptation in American politics, is of such great concern. And I realize that the Boston Globe, is it, that had this article today about US areas. This is a great concern. As I said before, the sense of responsibility of the international community in addressing and resolving crisis has made extraordinary progress. Perhaps this is an inevitable feature of the global age. I like to think that it is also the result of many efforts by those who believe that peace and security are everybody's concern. Among you are the future leaders of your professions, communities, and the government of your nations. You must make sure that this sense of responsibility continues to express itself through the most reasonable, effective, rational, and humane means. And in so doing, you will render the most important service to the pursuit of peace. And I think we all care for peace. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to open it up now for questions. I think we're just going to use these two microphones on the floor, and I ask you just to introduce yourself and phrase your question as a question, preferably with a question mark at the end. Thank you.
Madam Ogata, Andrew Lamming, a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I had two short questions, if I may, both ending with a question mark. The first one pertained to exactly what you spoke about tonight, and that is that if it really is absolutely imperative to keep dialogue open and to keep communication channels working, what would be your impression of the overall effect of having indicted Slobodan Milosevic as a war criminal and by the World Court, and thereby lost the avenue of keeping that person in dialogue, especially when we look now at the fact that he's still in power and that it's a major obstruction to him being able to participate in any sort of solution in the future? And my second question is unrelated to that one, and that is that obviously planning for refugees is a very imprecise science. So when there was an initial prediction of 100,000 refugees and 900,000 or even more turned up, exactly how does that happen on the ground with UNHCR? How do you make rapid decisions, and in fact, how did you come up with the number of perhaps 100,000?
Well, I think the second question is easier to answer. 100,000 is what we planned. In the case of a Kosovo outbreak in the spring of 1998, there was at that time the UN UNPREDEP forces in Macedonia, and it didn't happen that way. 98, the outflow was about 20,000 to Albania. But as the summer moved on and there were more internally displaced people, there were some 260,000 inside Kosovo and another 100,000 in the region, another 100,000 out in the rest of the world. We were obviously trying to cope with this. But as far as our own planning was concerned, in the spring of 1998, when the Rambouillet negotiations were taking place, we were planning for peace implementation. And I don't think there was anybody who was really warning us that there'll be another 1 million people out. I don't think that was in the planning of NATO, for example. What happened was, with the air action, we all left Kosovo. There was no, what shall I say, containment factor of an international presence in Kosovo. And with the air activity, naturally, the sense of revenge became much more stronger. And they were forced movement out. They were actually expelled. And this really put us in a very difficult situation of trying to cope with large numbers. And in Albania, the borders were open. In Macedonia, the Macedonians were very afraid to keep the borders open, that would flood So there were other various means that had to be devised. I think it's very difficult to plan for a million outflow. We never plan on million basis, because for that you need enormous resources, stockpiles and so on. But I think what we have to do is really to have some better planning and stand by arrangements more effectively. Now, on the question of Milosevic, you can argue it both ways. It was a moral condemnation and legal condemnation. But in today's legal and moral implementation structure, there's no way you can arrest him. That makes him more difficult to maybe negotiate with. Although I think with this kind of defeat that he suffered, and he, in a way, he is protected by some of his own people, his own entourage are intact. And I think he is using his political cards very effectively, although the Serbs are suffering. I think it would be a very difficult winter. In the long run, I think his power will wane. But in the short run, he is protected by a sense of Serbs being wronged by a lot of Serbs. I don't know, even after he was indicted, some of the political leaders went to negotiate with him.
Okay, let's turn just to this side and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Zayed Yassin. I'm an undergraduate here at the college. This past summer, I was in Albania working with Kosovo refugees, and I saw among the international aid and the NGO community a strong sentiment of dissatisfaction with UNHCR. There was a very widespread perception that UNHCR was unable to respond and react in a timely and effective manner to emerging developments. One example was that it was concerning the refugee return. But when the peace was signed, by the time UNHCR had put together a repatriation system, the majority of refugees had already returned via private means or through other organizations. So how would you, what plans do you have to reform the UNHCR and to work to improve your effectiveness to serve the refugee populations and to be able to respond to the speed of conflicts?
The repatriation plan as such, in scenario terms, we had it since April. I think we're the organization that had a plan. But to put that plan was something that required, again, a lot of after I don't know which month you were in Albania, but the situation changed a lot. Early June.
I was there for 2 weeks before the peace and 2 weeks immediately afterwards.
Yeah, but I think we went in with the one day after the KFOR forces. In that sense, we were able to bring in a lot of humanitarian assistance as the first round. But what we were trying to warn the people not to go back so quickly, because there were mines, there was a situation inside Kosovo was of great concern to us, because there were a lot of internally displaced people whose needs were probably should have been first met. But people, it was good. I felt that it was a good thing that people sort of made their choice with their feet. They moved back on their own, and which is something more than we could have done. We only did organized return for those who didn't have cars, who did not have the money to pay the taxis. Probably knew that one too. And so we helped the organized return for those who were more the weaker people, poor and weaker people. And we helped that one. But I think the fact that many of them went back so quickly showed that it was, I think to many of them it meant that it was their province, their country, that they could claim to be theirs and they could make the reconstruction. I thought it was a good thing they went back. We were, of course, worried about the security conditions, and still the security is not good today. I think if they can do spontaneous return, it takes place everywhere in the world. And it's not a bad thing. So you wanted us to organize all the cars from all these people who had their tractors?
I was more concerned, this is just one example of there's a bit, what I was more concerned with the feeling among the other international NGOs and international organizations was that something would happen, the other NGOs would respond to it, and UNHCR would be 3 days, 4 days a week behind in putting something together. To respond to the situation that it could.
The NGOs wanted to come back in the first round of the repatriation and the humanitarian assistance.
I'm not really referring
delivery.
right now so much to the
But I don't know the details of the 3 days or 4 days.
Hi, my name is James Williams, and I just recently ran for city council here in Cambridge.
Oh, I see, yes.
Within a day or two of the initiation of the NATO bombing, I attended a discussion at MIT with NATO briefing officers based in the United States, I believe in Norfolk, Virginia. There was someone from the Czech Republic, someone from Britain, a couple others, somebody from the United States. And I asked the question, and it was, other people chimed in. Had they alerted anybody or made any preparations for the predictable result of the initiation of bombing, which would be an escalation of attacks on the civilian population and a massive refugee crisis? And the answer came back, most certainly not. And then later there was sort of the excuse was, well, we're just the military, we do military stuff. And somebody else in the audience said that they'd heard you on the radio being interviewed, and that day or the day before, shortly, right after the bombing was begun, complaining that no one had notified you, no one had given you any warning to expect this impending, very serious refugee crisis. Is that correct? Were you not notified? Should you have been notified? What was the responsibility of NATO to you and to the world community in terms of notification for this impending refugee crisis?
As you said, I don't think NATO expected it.
Well, he said, I think they agreed that there was some expectation that this would be the predictable result. I find it hard to believe that
I find it very hard to
would not
believe.
have.
But also, if you read now the reports of the expected length of the air activities, it was a very short period. That seems, I don't know how many days the NATO forces expected the bombing to continue, but reading from all these reports that in the press and so on, I don't think there was that expectation for the air activity to last for 78 days, and that there will be almost 1 million people being forced out. I don't think that was in the case. I thought there was going to be a much more pinpointed, effective military activities that would end the Milosevic, the Serb military activities inside Kosovo. That was the expectation. But I'm not a military. Military usually have many plans, and I hope there was some plans that exist, which I don't know. But what we had of course, we knew that there was military activity was imminent. And that what we were, on the 24th, I think that was the day of March when we withdrew from Kosovo. Before that, we were downsizing some of our operations of our colleagues so that the essential staff would be there. But we were delivering humanitarian assistance to about 400,000 people inside Kosovo. We made the last delivery on that day and then drove out to Macedonia. And I think we expected refugee outflow, not that scale.
There was no responsibility to try to alert you to the possibility of an emergency, a very
Of a
serious
large-scale refugee outflow.
Should NATO have called you up and said, Mrs. Ogata, there's an impending risk of a serious refugee crisis, we're about to begin bombing?
I don't think they had that. They did not inform us, nor I don't think they predicted it.
Let's go to the other side.
Hi, Kari Heisted, Acting Executive Director for the Japan Society of Boston. How do you see the eroding leadership of the United States and the United Nations community affecting the work that you're doing?
The United States, I think, is the only superpower. And it's the only power with large areas of payment, which is, I think, we can say, is undermining its effectiveness and its leadership, which is very worrying for the whole UN. So, as you know, the payment of contribution, assessed contribution, is a treaty obligation. And the largest and the most important superpower not carrying out the treaty obligation is undermining not only US influence, but the UN effectiveness. As far as my own work is concerned, Many of the assistance, development assistance, humanitarian assistance, are done on voluntary contribution basis. And in those areas, especially the humanitarian assistance and refugee protection, U.S. has continued to be the major donor country. What is more worrying is the fall in the development assistance. Because if the whole effectiveness of the UN declines, if the whole effectiveness of development assistance declines, we cannot be just going on forever giving humanitarian assistance. So the international collaborative regime power would go down, and that is very worrying.
I'm Maria Cristina Caballero. I am a research fellow at the Shorenstein Center for the Press and Politics here at the Kennedy School. And I am from Colombia, South America. And you pointed out in your speech that it is necessary to do creative thinking about these problems, these many problems all around the world. I wonder what if you have had some creative thinking about what to do in Colombia and what to do with the 1.5 million displaced people that we have there that are not receiving really aid from international organizations like yours. And I wonder, someone told me that you have stated that it's not the mandate of your office because you are dedicated to refugees and these are internally displaced people. But seeing them, as a journalist, I have been there in the zones where there are concentrations of these displaced people. That's a theoretical response that for them, they are dying, they are starving. And what to do urgently to help them. It seems that just now, the US is studying the possibility of sending aid to Colombia, a package of aid, but mainly military aid to destroy coca crops that will intensify the conflict, according to experts, because a lot of these people would be without these crops will join directly the forces in conflict. They don't have alternatives really. In Colombia, the economy is doing terrible, and the rate of unemployment is 20%. Then I wonder what creative thinking have you done about Colombia, please?
All through Latin America and Central America, the refugee problems have been solved. And this is a great feat that we are very pleased about. I was closed the last Guatemalan refugee camps in Mexico, for example. But Colombia is the only exception. And Colombia is internal conflict causing internal displacement. And it is, I think the rebels have almost control over close to 2/3 of the country. And it is a very serious worrying situation that is developing. We are trying to solicit the help of the neighboring countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, Panama, in order, if there's a need, to keep the borders open so that people can flee. That is coming straight out of our own mandated responsibility. But within Colombia, we have been asked to provide technical assistance to coordinate the work of the various NGOs and the various UN agencies that have been doing some assistance with regard to internally displaced people. And to that extent, we are trying to help in a limited way, because if you really want to do material assistance to all the IDP, it's a colossal assistance program that I think a refugee agency should not be at the forefront, although we are trying to work out and helping the displaced and the people who have been coming to ask for more assistance in a very limited way. But I don't think we should be the ones that would be taking the lead role in a purely internal displacement situation.
But already the neighboring countries have sent back
Yes, we have protested in those cases, and we're trying to do everything to keep the borders open when there's a need. And this is far we have been doing.
We're going to just take these last questions with the individuals at the mics. What I suggest is that you issue your question, and then we'll come to the right and then back. And if you could just retain the questions and respond to all three of them.
Oh, I listened to all three?
Listen to all three.
All right, fine.
Good evening, Madam High Commissioner. My name is Darrell Lee. I'm a student at Harvard College, and I have two questions. I'm afraid they're not very related. The first is about refugee protection. I think you will agree that in the 1990s, the humanitarian aspect of UNHCR's mission has expanded greatly, and there are some that charge this may come at the expense of UNHCR's refugee protection mandate. In India this summer, I worked with refugees from Afghanistan, and I found that the protection efforts there were woefully inadequate in my personal experience, and I was wondering if you could address this problem. The second alludes to the predicament that Samantha Power illustrated so well, namely the Rwandan refugee camps between 1994 and 1996. And it is clear now that the UNHCR was indirectly supporting the remnants of a genocidal regime, and the situation was clearly untenable before the Rwandans had to come in and break up the camps themselves. So my question in that regard is, what could you have done, or what would you have done as High Commissioner and your office to, well, what would you have done differently, basically?
Hi, my name is Guy Edmonds. I used to be a student at the Kennedy School. My question is about, we've heard you call for international leadership and greater preventive action. And my question is, what can you do to help politicians in domestic countries build the necessary consensus and support for such leadership and preventive action? Because politicians are politicians and want to retain power, they want to do things where there is clear sort of political incentive, and there's not much obvious political incentive in being seen to prevent something that doesn't actually happen, or anything like that. Thanks.
My name is Gunilla Fink. I'm currently studying at Tufts University. You warned about military or unrestrained military intervention as logic and talked a lot about plans. Now, you can often hear that when it comes to an intervention, the military are the only ones which have a plan, and that civil agencies lack plans, and that especially the interagency process is non-existing. So I would like to hear if you've experienced this lack of interagency planning.
Okay, one more snuck
One
up.
more. All right.
I'm Sam Groger. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I had a question about, you mentioned that attention seems to be focused on the point of catastrophe, and that's when the intervention takes place. And it seems also that the media tends to focus on those points. And I wanted to see to what extent you find that media attention drives pressure for you to act or for other organizations to act, and what's your feeling about that and how that could be changed in the terms of dealing with the wider context as you talked about, in terms of dealing with the problems at an earlier stage.
These are very good questions all around. Refugee protection. And have we done things, you said you were to Afghanistan, is that what you said you were in Afghanistan? No, no, you were...
In India.
In India. At the expense of protection. Well, you see, protection is a range of activities. And I think the bottom line of protection starts from asylum, assuring that refugees who have to flee for reasons of persecution, violence, etc., are given asylum. That is a very important cornerstone of protection. But then it goes beyond just giving asylum. What kind of asylum do you give? If people flee in large numbers, what kind of conditions do we provide? Refugee camps, refugee settlements. Sometimes in Africa they stayed in villages. So there's a whole gamut of all sorts of measures that are good. While they are in refugee camps, the basic thing we try to provide is security, so that they will be properly kept safe. And that requires negotiating with the host governments and so on. But beyond that, you do have to make sure that they're given health care, food, and preferably education and so on. But that is not the end of protection. We try to find ways for their problems to be solved. And this is why there was a question of repatriation is important. That is a very major way of solving, by way of helping them return to their countries, the countries where they came from. And very often the countries they came from may not yet be safe, in which case we try to bring them information so that they can have better decisions or basis for taking decisions. So I think the question of refugee protection has to be understood in this overall context. And I don't think we have done things at the expense of protection, because protection has this varied, a whole range of activities that are important. Rwanda 94, 96, we provided the genocidaires to be in the camps, yes. And it was a very painful experience because we knew that there were people who were genocidaires, criminals, armed elements in the camp. What would I have done otherwise? What we tried to do is even warning from August of 94. We knew that the armed elements were there. We got at the border crossing in Goma. We did, I think the Congolese or Zairian at that time took away their weapons and so on. But people went through various border points. There were arms. And we wanted them to be separated. And I have a lot of recorded requests for separation of the armed elements, the military elements. That would have been much, much more important if you had kept all the inter-harmless and the military people in a separate camp. There was a plan at one point to do that, but it was never enforced. And this is what we're trying to insist, that there will be peacekeeping forces, at least, or some law and order forces come in to separate these people. Because this led to a much larger, a longer problem that the states and all the people in the Great Lakes region in Africa got into problems. So that is what I would like to see. And this is what exactly what the number 4 question was asking about ways of intervention. What we're trying to advocate, I have to protect refugees. But in order to protect refugees, there are other mechanisms that have to be set up. That is, other intervention mechanisms, conflict-solving mechanisms. We can do it at the lowest level, being there and helping as much as possible to supervise that the refugees are safe and so on. But beyond that, you need maybe strengthening the local law enforcement capacity, which is the responsibility of states, theoretically and legally. But so many states don't have that capacity anymore. Or local, or sub-regional peacekeeping forces. I think there has to be ladders of options that we could resort to in order to meet these kind of situations of anarchy or a mixture of civilians and armed elements. This is what I think the lesson of the Rwandan refugee crisis have shown us. And I think this is very much in the Security Council report on African peacekeeping and so on. This is included. You see, right now you have the very low-level humanitarian presence in the camps and trying to contain the situation that way. And then you have the very, very top-level international peacekeeping, but nothing in between. That is something that is needed, and if I had all the power and the money and the bodies to do these things, I would certainly do that rather than giving macaronis. But we don't give macaronis, as you said in the beginning. I don't think that is in our food pipeline very much. How to help politicians to become more politically alert, is that what you were asking?
To create a domestic constituency.
You have to make the domestic constituency by insisting more and talking to them. Otherwise, I can certainly, when I meet them, but I have no vote or anything. I have nothing to, except that humanitarian issues, if you're talking about your political leaders, is rather close to the hearts of many people, because you are still very much a refugee migrant society. And the memories of these suffering still get a lot of response. So please push more on that basis. Stop people from having to become refugees. That is the important thing that if the American political leaders could be, it's not only America. Many of the industrialized countries, the leaders are becoming much, much too inward-looking and media-driven. Now, that's the last question that you asked, how to change them. Media has helped a lot, and whether was in Congo or Bosnia, without the media coming out to the front of all the human rights violations and humanitarian situation, I don't know whether we could have fought a humanitarian cause. At the same time, they are, what shall I say, to get consistent, coherent media attention is difficult. And I think at the same, this is why I like the media. I try to work with them. I ask them to come with me when I go sometimes on missions and so on. They're very important. But yet again, it depends a great deal on what the media thinks is the expectation or the response of the people who are watching. Television is especially unbalanced in that sense. To get, you think Kosovo is solved? Judging from the headlines and the television, you probably think Kosovo is all solved. I mean, it's very hard to maintain television attention for a very long period. Written press is a little bit better. The serious written press.
Please join me in thanking Madame Ogata for taking the time to speak here.
Okay.
This time next year, I suppose. We have a slavery in Sudan event that I have to run to. It's a pleasure.
I just wanted to say, hopefully you'll accept our invitation next year. Oh, yes, I know that. Yeah, I know. So maybe next year.
Next year, fine.
それまして時間が上手大学出身です。いつも勇気づけられてます。ありがとうございます。Hello, Mark. So nice to see you. Hello, I'm here for Roddy's Life. Hello.
My name is Emily Anderson. I want to ask you a very quick question about where the UNHCR stood on the issue of Palestinian refugees.
We are not, there is an organization, and they have a geographic area. But outside on individual cases, we do try to
How are you doing on the